Harry S. Truman had previously been an artillery officer in World War I, seeing action at the Battle of St. Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne offensive, and the defensive sector. Truman came under attack by the Germans and rallied his men to fight them back, losing none of his men in the process. His artillery unit also supported future General George S. Patton's Tank Brigade on World War I. During the Second World War, Truman was a senator and had tried to resign his seat to serve in the war, but President Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't allow him to, and he had him become vice president in the 1944 election. Truman would unwillingly become president of the United States in April of 1945 after the untimely death of FDR. President Truman oversaw the end of World War II, and although there was no doubt that the Allies were gonna win, Truman had made the difficult decisions regarding agreements with the Soviet Union about the post-World War II world while the war was still going on. One major issue was that the Soviets were unwilling to allow for elections in Eastern Europe, as they considered them to be unnecessary because Stalin was going to install communist satellite states as a buffer without regard for the United States or what anyone else thought. One of the most common countries where issues arose about was the post-war Polish government, as the government in exile was in London, yet the Soviets had occupied Poland and were not having any ideas about allowing members of the government in exile to come back and run the post-war administration. Harry S. Truman and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov got in very heated arguments and telegrams with one another, to the point where Molotov had said that he had never been spoken in such a way in his entire life than he had when he was talking to Harry Truman. However, the Truman administration would consistently meet these challenges in Europe as best as he could and worked out the end of World War II. World War II in the Pacific Theater was also overseen by Truman, and he made the decision to make the first and only use of atomic weapons against a belligerent state during wartime, that being nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He did so to avoid enacting a land invasion of Japan, which would have killed more Allied and Japanese soldiers as well as civilians than the nukes did. Truman also handled the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945 and ended World War II. Truman's administration was also tasked with the occupation of Germany and Japan. In Germany, the Allied occupation zones were created and Berlin was divided between Allied powers. Western Germany was created in 1949 and East Germany, as Nazi Germany had been stripped of all sovereignty after the war. Japan was allowed to keep the emperor only as a figurehead as the new government was created, and because MacArthur was leading the Japanese occupation, the Soviets were not allowed to partition the Japanese islands. One of the greatest pieces of foreign policies that had come about in U.S. history occurred during the Truman administration, and that was the Marshall Plan. Under the Marshall Plan, the U.S. rebuilt all of Western Europe and provided economic aid to them. This created a speedy recovery of Western Europe and also proved that capitalism is awesome and communism sucked. Meanwhile, the U.S. offered to spread the Marshall Plan into the Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe to rebuild the Eastern European states, but the Soviets rejected American aid. Within the Eastern Bloc, the Soviets enacted the Molotov Plan, where states they occupied would enter trade agreements with the Soviet Union and remain in the Eastern Bloc. The plan was also quite contradictory, as it also called for former Axis states under occupation to pay reparations even though they were completely destroyed. Stalin's puppet governments were also set up, and there was a clear difference between Eastern and Western Europe. If you're not picking up what I'm saying, basically, once again, communism sucks. The early foundations of the Cold War began to show in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. During the Turkish Strait crisis, the Soviets demanded that Soviet ships be allowed to pass freely through the Turkish Straits, and Turkey refused, and America sent in a carrier just to make a point. In the Greek Civil War, Britain and the U.S. supported the Kingdom of Greece, as Churchill and Stalin had agreed to divide Southern Europe between each other at the end of World War II. The Truman Doctrine was passed in 1947 to support democracies threatened by authoritarian regimes. The doctrine also called for the containment of communism and the Soviet Union, and also advocated against Soviet expansion on the world stage in order to maintain the existing balance of power. The effect would be that the Truman Doctrine would give birth to the later domino theory, which stated that if one state fell to communism, then others around it would likely to fall like dominoes. In 1948, the Soviets initiated the Berlin blockade in June, where they decided to seal passage from West Berlin and blockaded the city. The Soviets sought to starve the city, and things were very tense as Soviet and American tanks had a standoff. There were fears of World War III starting here because communism sucks. However, the Truman administration enacted the Berlin Airlift, where relief supplies were dropped into West Berlin, and there was nothing the Soviets could do about it, because then they would be the one to start the war by shooting down American and Allied aircraft. NATO was formed in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The second phase of the Chinese Civil War broke out right at the end of World War II, and the communists pushed the nationalists out of mainland China. The Marshall Mission had taken place to try to get the nationalists and communists to work things out, but that failed. However, Truman did not abandon the Republic of China after their retreat to Taiwan. On June 27, 1950, after the outbreak of fighting in Korea, Truman ordered the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent further conflict between the communist government on the Chinese mainland and Taiwan. Another major foreign policy event that took place was the Indochina War between the French and Viet Minh. Truman's hesitation to support France against the Viet Minh was considered by some to be a factor in France losing to the communists and seeing Indochina split between North and South Vietnam, as well as the subsequent Vietnam War. However, U.S. forces were predominantly occupied with fighting in Korea and many other Cold War commitments, and committing to Indochina would have overstretched the U.S. even further. The Korean War took place under the Truman administration starting in 1950, where he got a UN intervention on behalf of South Korea, calling it a police action. However, the war would draw in Chinese intervention, and Korea dragged on in an unpopular stalemate throughout the rest of Truman's administration and became the first major proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviets. Truman avoided the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict and set a precedent of conventional warfare in proxy wars. The war ended in a stalemate after President Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed office in 1953. Additionally, the Truman administration oversaw the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, as there was a massive covert action gap between the U.S. and the Soviets, and everything was about to get interesting with spying and the Cold War type of stuff like that. Of course, there was a lot more aspects to the Truman administration's foreign policy and its impacts, but this video was just a brief summary. Like with all presidents, the decisions made by Truman are done without hindsight and sometimes are done with incomplete information, or he was given a decision between two bad choices. But what did you think of Truman's foreign policy? Write in the comments below, and thank you for watching.